Good, thank you.
Good to see you. Professor Wang, what do you think? Should we begin and we simply switch the running order?
Yeah, maybe let's do that. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. And Kyle, if you can also start recording, I think you already have. That's great. Wonderful. So, dear guests, colleagues, and students at Seton Hall University, thank you very much for joining us this morning for the talk, The War for Ukraine, Ukrainian Civil Resistance and Implications for Global Peace. So my name is Professor David Wood. I'm a professor of practice at the School of Diplomacy at Seton Hall University. And along with Zheng Wang, who will be presenting later, I'm one of the leadership figures within the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. And this talk has been organized by the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. It is actually the second in a series of, for want of a better expression, crisis discussions or crisis talks. We had our first one as the events in Ukraine were unfolding, with the withdrawal of US and international forces and the impact on the country and the global order. And we're now having a second conversation given the remarkable and tragic events within Ukraine. So, as you all know, on the 24th of March, Russian troops entered Ukraine, marking the start of the invasion and shattering the lives of Ukrainians in the process. Given estimates from yesterday, we are looking at over 3.5 million refugees within a period of more or less 4 weeks, which is also an unprecedented movement of people forced from war. We're also potentially looking at just under 6.5 million internally displaced people within Ukraine itself, as well as over 2,000 civilian casualties. So this is a war which has deeply impacted on the Ukrainian population and the potential for a stable and prosperous and happy future. The Ukrainians have met the military invasion not just with military defense, but also with civilian resistance, which is potentially unprecedented in such a type of war. We've all seen the pictures of Ukrainians stood in front of tanks, talking to soldiers, taking actions to prevent and mitigate the impact of war that are non-lethal. And that's something we should be praising and that we should be learning from. And today is an opportunity to do so. In response to both the military and the civilian resistance, the war has changed in nature, it seems, to one of attrition, with targeting of civilian areas, in some way shadowing and repeating the events of the Second Chechen War and also in northern Syria. So it's clear that there are other conflict contexts that we can learn from for Ukraine as well. So the people of Ukraine are suffering, the future of Ukraine is in question, but we also see a war in Europe as well. European states, along with the United States, are providing lethal weaponry to Ukrainian military as well as training. These weapons are the weapons that are being used to destroy tanks, to shoot down planes, and to defend Ukraine. So I think it's not an exaggeration to say that many states in Europe are at war with Russia through Ukraine. That military war has also been shadowed and balanced by an economic warfare through a set of sanctions that have been implemented against Russia, as well as a war in the information space around what is happening in Ukraine and what should be the appropriate end goal of the war in Ukraine. And as well as for Europe, though, we also have global implications. This is a big test for the global community and the functioning of multilateral institutions, and so far we've been let down. We were not able to prevent a war in Ukraine, and we're looking at the potential for a likely new Cold War. At the same time, the events in Ukraine are having repercussions around the world for the way that other conflicts will be managed, but also for the potential for stability. As I'm sure you all know, that Ukraine and Russia are two of the biggest providers of grain for the international food market. And at the moment, that production is dropping, which will have severe implications for places such as in the Middle East, where we are likely to see a surge in civilian local violence and conflict and potentially further Arab Spring events. So we're dealing with very, very big questions, and we're very fortunate to have some remarkable people join us to give us their thoughts on these questions. So just to summarize, those questions that we'll be looking at today are: what is the role of civilian resistance in achieving peace within Ukraine? And we'll have our dear colleague Nina Potarska talk on that. What is the potential for peace in Ukraine and in Europe? And we'll have our colleague Donald Jensen give his thoughts on that. What does this war mean for other neighboring states to Russia, which also have histories of relationships during and after the Soviet period? And our dear colleague, Professor Hans Guthrie, will give his thoughts of that, especially from the Georgian experience. And then also, what does this mean for how other global conflicts will be managed? And we'll have my colleague at the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, Professor Zheng Wang, provide his thoughts based upon the example of Taiwan and China. So that's the background. Nina, did you manage to get your computer started? Are you with us now? I saw that Nina appeared briefly. Kyle, is Nina there?
She's in the lobby right now. Not in the lobby, but actually on the call. Might be having trouble with camera.
Okay. So in which case, I would move first on to Donald. Are you able to speak first, Donald, before we come back?
I sure am. Well, you covered the highlights pretty well already. So
right.
Let me,
well,
go ahead.
Let me just give you a brief background for everyone who doesn't know you. So Donald Jensen is the Director of Russia and Europe at the United States Institute for Peace. He joined USIP after 4 years with the Center for European Policy Analysis, where he was a senior fellow and an editor-in-chief. He writes extensively on Russian domestic politics and Russian foreign and security policy. He also specializes in the domestic and foreign policies of other post-Soviet states, especially Ukraine, Georgia, and Baltic republics. So, Donald, wonderful to have you here. Please.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And as a product of a Jesuit prep school education, I have to ask if Seton Hall is a Jesuit university. And I think it is.
We're definitely Catholic. I'm not sure if we have a Jesuit background. Perhaps Professor Wang can answer that later.
Anyway, thank you for inviting me. I want to take my time really to go over the military state of play, what we know, there are many questions, and what we know about answering some of those questions, and finally, where this appears to be going over the next weeks and months. And I would be glad to answer as many questions as the group wants to pose. I would have to say, after almost 30 days of fighting, we either have a stalemate or we have Russia losing, depending on how you look at it. And this is a great, great shock to the entire Washington pundit class. Not that we're right about a lot of things, but this is completely unexpected. But it could go back in the Russian direction relatively soon, so we just have to see. So let me look at what's happened the first few weeks, what the surprises have been, the state of negotiations, and maybe a comment or two on Russia's domestic politics. David, if that would be okay. Excuse me. Most of you read in middle to February about the 190,000 Russian troops massed around the Ukrainian border, and almost all of those are now committed. In fact, the Russians, in one sense, are running out of troops. Russia hoped for a quick blitzkrieg, which would take Kiev, which would take some of the major cities, and which would extend Russia's control over the North Black Sea coast. And other than the Black Sea area in the south, every Russian major city is not yet captured by the invading forces. The most dire, of course, is Mariupol, which is close to Donbass, which is the scene of horrific human tragedies. But in Kharkiv, which is Russian-speaking, they're holding out. Kiev is relatively protected so far, despite the efforts of the Russian military to take it and other cities. Odessa has been almost not touched at all. So what happened? Evidently, the Kremlin expected a blitzkrieg that would take Kiev in the first few days of the invasion, moving troops down from Belarus in the northeast toward Kiev, moving east from Lugansk, and then, as I said earlier, moving southwest along the Black Sea coast to capture the major cities along the coast. Almost none of that has happened, as I said, except for Mariupol. Casualty estimates on the Russian side range from the conservative, about 7,000 or 8,000, to the Ukrainian claim, which is more than 15,000 dead and 3 times that wounded. And certainly the Russians have experienced a huge loss of equipment, 400 tanks, all the many armored personnel carriers, many aircraft, and so forth. Having been stymied in that first week, the Russians have gradually changed their strategy to attacking cities, the old classic Russian way of warfare. They have, as you saw in Mariupol, attacked civilian targets, hospitals, orphanages, private residences. They are not close enough in Kiev to do that to that beautiful city, but this is the classic Russian way of warfare. And interestingly, because after all the years, since roughly 2008, of Russian military reform, everything seems to have gone wrong at once. Bad planning, bad coordination, bad training, bad tactics. And the Ukrainian army, which, as you recall, surrendered almost without a shot in 2014 when they took Crimea, has been responding admirably, bravely, and we have to see how long that holds out. That's partly because of the Russian mistakes. It's partly because, frankly, of excellent training by NATO and the United States of their armed forces. And I think most of all because the Ukrainians are defending their homes. And I have Ukrainian news right here in my office. President Zelensky is making remarks, but if you speak Ukrainian, they talk always about defending our land. And that's what they're doing. There have been all sorts of comic and serious memes, you've probably seen them, posters of Cossacks and so forth. So this is awakening in Ukraine a sense of nationhood that they already had, but now this is becoming very fierce, extremely anti-Russian, and for the time being, that will I think, sustain them. Where is this going? It's not clear. One view is that Russia, with its horrific grinding down tactics, will eventually prevail through sheer force of arms and sheer numbers. That is probably the majority view. The second view would be Ukraine will win. And what is winning here? Well, in many ways, Ukraine has not lost so far, and that, in a sense, is winning. And the third view, which probably I would lean toward, is a stalemate. That of the many, many issues on the negotiating table, and my own view is that the negotiations have not yet gotten serious. This is going to take a long time to sort out, if ever. And one of our guests is an expert on Georgia, I see, and there's every possibility that Russia will just park where they are along the Black Sea in the east and just stall negotiations or prolong the situation in sort of a, I hate to say frozen conflict, because it's certainly not frozen, but that's also another possibility. I don't think the negotiations are yet very serious. If you've read von Clausewitz, you know the phrase culminating point. We have not yet had a culminating point in the Ukrainian conflict. That could be a capture of Kiev, but it could also be a mutiny by Russian troops who are sitting there without food, very cold, very harassed, lied to, because a lot of them did not know they were going to go to Ukraine. Finally, I would say, since I only have a few minutes, is that this has been a shock to many people inside Russia, although the overwhelming amount of the population, according to a poll I saw even this morning, supports the war effort. There are, I think, visible and obvious fissures in the elite. Anatoly Chubais, formerly a darling of Western high-tech people, left Russia this week. There are obvious dissent in the security services. There is obviously some dissent in the armed forces. Will that force Putin to back down? There's no sign of it so far. Putin seems very resolute. They talk again overnight about using nuclear weapons in Poland or elsewhere or on the battlefield. There is no sign at all that Putin is moving for a compromise in the next couple of weeks. Though these next couple of weeks will be critical, the Russian draft season is about on us, where new untrained recruits will no doubt have to be thrown into the mix, and that will create, I think, some instability in the Russian armed forces, which may result in a decisive turn one way or the other, but we will have to see. What I am confident about, however, is in combination with the sanctions, that we are really seeing, in my view, the end of Putinism as a system that governs Russia. Now, he may depart, and others could take his place, some even worse than he is. He may stay, but he may stay around as a damaged good. But I think the Ukrainians will fight forever, frankly. And in my personal view, is the Kremlin can't kill them all. So we have to see. Over to you, David.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for providing us with that frame. We're going to try again with Nina. She is actually a refugee herself within Poland at the moment, so we know that the internet connection where she is a bit difficult. Nina,
yes,
are you there now?
here. Yes.
Oh, wonderful. We're so happy. Thank you for joining us. So Nina, I'll just give it a moment to explain your background, and then it would be good to hear from you. So Nina Potarski is the Ukraine National Coordinator for WILPF, which is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, I think. I'm not sure what the F is for,
Yes.
but it's definitely peace. She has been working for many years as first a journalist and then as a community peace builder and a women's representative in Eastern Ukraine. So since 2016, she's been the national coordinator for WILPF. The focus of her work is to improve the participation of women and ensure gender perspectives and responses within the way that peace is promoted and pursued within Ukraine. She also focuses on identifying human rights violations based on gender analysis and also looking at what transitional justice would look like in a context like Ukraine. So she has been involved in monitoring the rights of women near the contact line in the Donbass, as well as conflict-related violence in the same area. She has also, since 2013, been the director of the Center for Social and Labor Studies, and since 2015 has been studying topics related to the conflict in Eastern Ukraine. So, and as I just said, Nina is a wonderful woman, and we're very glad to have you, Nina, but you're also in Poland at the moment. So I know that you've had to leave Ukraine given the troubles there. So Nina, it would be great to get your perspectives, especially on civilian resistance and the role of women within promoting peace. Thank you.
Thank you for this invitation, and I welcome all those who are indifferent to the topic of the war in Ukraine, and I'm grateful for the invitation to speak and to speak in a such respected circle of speakers. And but I'm of course not glad because of why I'm here, and I I'm able to talk about this in the same time my colleagues, my friends and my sisters now in danger under the fire, under the shelling, some of them are evacuating people from places where even humanitarian organizations refuse to go. So with this background, I will try to start. And I started working with the conflict theme from the very beginning, from 2014. And my first idea was to show everyday life and how unsafe this everyday life for women during the war. Because the infrastructure suffer during the conflict and social infrastructure as well. And the woman and the female gender role, it's like marks their life role and caring about children, elderly people, caring about everything around them, psychological help for kids and old people, organizing food, buying something what family needs. So all these issues on women's shoulders. So I wanted to give more importance to these stories of women. And because in the same time in Ukraine, we had curiosization of the glorification of military, and woman was like in a shadow. And at the same time, women carry all the potential for dialogue, also through this kind of communication in the society. And women role like a glue, and it can glue together and glue together one society. And with the helps of these communications through hospitals, horizontal communication, through social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, kindergartens, and therefore I given the role they given this role in society. It's very useful. Include women into the negotiation process and bring the approach and way of thinking about society. Because if you are even today, because I got just the last part of previous speakers, but on conference also, men are talking about some strategic things and about countries and about role of the society, but women approach and feminist approach in peace, it's always from personal stories. So even in this way, we need to be to sitting together to mix this approach and find something in the middle. So the situation that we experienced it 8 years ago was like a local version of the today nightmare, because of course even for me now it's hard to imagine how it's possible to have this now. And this war now affected everyone. And from my interviews from 2014 and 2015, because I started this interview from both sides of parties for conflicts, from so-called Donetsk People Republic, non-government controlled territories, and government controlled territories. And I remember very good how they are express their feeling that it's so hard and so difficult to be in ignorance, and local government not recognize their suffering, and they really want to show for Kyiv, and maybe Kyiv as a capital would understand this situation with a conflict after Kyiv will be under the shelling. So, and that time I saw that it's impossible. I understand why they will, but I thought that it's impossible. And how I briefly trying to go to the situation with peace works, which we are continue doing, because we started like not like a WILF, because through my first research I got a lot of contacts of women from both sides, and I tried to put them in some network and try to be in touch with them during all these 8 years. And now many of them started their own humanitarian organization or charity foundation or women organization. So now these contacts, these brilliant women organize a network of women who are using approach of dialogue during this conflict. And in our group, and I really appreciate how we deal with this conflict now, because we had this experience of mediation and communications through the border, and of course now we in different situation after all of this, because last month showed us that some of us on government-controlled territory, some of us in Russia now, me in Poland, some of my colleagues in Germany, in Italy, and everywhere, but we're still able to talk to each other. And I'm really hope to have this ability in the next months, and keep this and maybe scale this experience for other groups and other spaces for dialogue, because it's very important to see person with a personality, with the needs, and with a feeling, and avoid the dehumanization through this terrible experience. Because today it's very important just make this connection between people. And of course, every day we started with checking who is still alive, and who needs money, or how we can help from abroad to our colleagues. And now I have no ideas for continue this work of peace building, because there are no space for even talk about peace, because it's so many pain, so many losses, and so many, but really important to still continue live in humanity, and not use to see each other like a person in personality. And but before we had a couple of very nice and very maybe naive experience of communication in the breach. We call these women dialogues without borders. And we are trying to organize this communication before the meeting and during the meeting in the Lugansk, in the territory on the bridge. It's a middle between the territories of non-government control and government control. And the main idea for us was just find the key points for these two groups, and very easy, like a ceasefire, like a humanitarian help for people who are crossing the border, and continue this connection between people. Also, now it's also very important because my friends from Russia who in touch with us through many others dialogue platform, I feel how they are stuck in the media mess, because now we have no common media space, and we are in our reality, they are in their own reality. So we need through media also build this connection. And I really I hope and I believe that in the next months we will organize common platform for this kind of communication, because we are recognize our enemy, because we are know nothing about feelings, about backgrounds of this person and which experience bring this person to this position. So at the first we need to start to talk, but for this step we need to be in peace inside also. And to be in peace inside, we need to have enough of strength. And to have enough of strength, we need to cover our basic needs. So maybe now it's not time for these talks, but we need to be prepared for these talks in the next future. And I hope with this kind of platform, conference, dialogues and exchange between of our experience, we will have a chance to have a peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for reminding us that this isn't a war of 30 days. It is a war that's been going on and affecting women and men since 2014. And thank you for reminding us that women have proved that they provide a social glue. They are a potential force for peace, to connect and rebuild society. And because of that, they need to be at the negotiation table, providing their perspectives. But also this call for humanity, not to demonize the other, I think is very brave during a period of war, and it's wonderful to hear. But with the realization, maybe not just yet, we've got to prepare for it. So how do we do that? And thank you also for raising this point about the need for a common media space. So you missed the introduction, but I talked about the fact that we're also in an information war with people living in different realities, and we do need to overcome that. So thank you. We'll definitely have so many questions for you in a moment. We're going to go, if that's okay, to our next speaker, my dear colleague Hans Guthrie, who is also a senior fellow at the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. Hans has worked in the Caucasus since 1999. From this vantage point, he's observed some of Russia's more aggressive policies towards its neighboring countries from close up. He's worked as regional director of the Caucasus Research Resource Centers, overseeing offices in Armenia, Azerbaijan and Georgia from 2006 to 12. More recently, he's worked with think tanks and has written on regional developments, including the Karabakh War, for outlets such as Foreign Policy and the Global Policy Journal. He's also someone that I have known for a long time, and I believe to be a bit of a genius. So I'm very much looking forward to your input as well, Hans. So thank you very much. A human genius.
Well, David, thank you for that overly generous introduction, and thank you to my previous speakers, and also, of course, Nina, that emphasis on peace couldn't be more important, that you have made. what I want to add relatively briefly is just maybe the broader perspective of Georgia. That's both a broader geographical perspective, but even adds additional years onto the years, Nina, that you have mentioned, since of course Georgia has had its own experience of conflicts in 2008, arguably going back further with kind of mobilization used as leverage by and kind of separatist territories used as leverage by the Kremlin. I wouldn't say by Russia, so to speak, because as we of course see, is those are not policies that are democratically legitimized in any profound way, given that the space that there isn't even an opportunity to discuss what's going on in Russia right now. So what do we see about when we look to Georgia, the 2008 conflict, which had some similarities, they had lots of differences. The Georgians, after a fierce, brief fight, decided not to defend in any depth. But it had similarities in that there was premeditation. It had similarities in that breakaway territory was used as a flashpoint to make an argument and or to kind of incite an actual conflict. And I think some similarities can be seen there. One of the similarities is that it's actually very hard to make a really lasting peace with the Kremlin. That's sobering when you look at the Georgian context. But as a British diplomat put it to me, and it's hard to put it better than that, the Kremlin doesn't really do win-win. It is unfortunately a situation where even attempts to be conciliatory, as we have had it with the Georgian Dream government in Georgia, that in many ways has been subservient to many Russian interests, doesn't actually pay any dividends. And arguably a somewhat similar view from Yerevan, which, though a faithful strategic ally to Moscow, found itself largely alone at a critical juncture. So this creates a really profound challenge. And I think, as several scholars of Ukraine have pointed out, the call that we hear in some places in the West about, well, Finlandization might not be so bad. Well, what exact solution the Ukrainian people find in the end, and Ukrainian government finds in the end, is up to them. It's their situation. But I think at least the voices in the West that hold out that there is an easy fix to that if you just give in or kind of make some kind of compromise, I think need to contend with the reality that unfortunately the Kremlin doesn't really keep its own side of the bargain. And Georgia also still has tens of thousands of additional IDPs to show for this that have not been able to go back to their homes or have lived under effective apartheid conditions, which often aren't called out in that way because the people that know best what it's like are people that like to go back into Abkhazia, people that somehow want to keep relations with South Ossetia and therefore don't want to say maybe quite as clearly how horrendous the situations there are for people that aren't even second-class citizens, but are effectively in a very, very difficult situation. Perhaps Georgia also is instructive about the importance about, I take this term from David, who I've had great collaboration with in many things over the years, but how important it is to right-size the story. Right now, the world, as many people have said, inhabits the Ukrainian narrative. I think long-term, it is very, very important that that narrative is accurate and corresponds with what we see overall. And I think the Georgian side has not necessarily done itself favors by trying to have a maximalist version of its own story of what happened in 2008, which has unfortunately led people to disbelieve some of the Georgian claims and underestimate the malevolence we have seen from the Kremlin. Again, I don't say Russia, but some of the malevolence we've seen from the Kremlin, or the roughness of how that security apparatus treats people it considers to be weaker. Now, how about the regional situation? So when we look forward from 2008 and the past into the future, I think the thing to say is that daunting as that conflict is all across Europe. I'm currently speaking from Berlin, where you actually see also the refugees arriving on the train station. It's something that in some places in the former Soviet Union is very present, because those people have seen a war, in some cases in the early 90s, and then again in a case like Georgia in 2008. And if you've experienced war, then suddenly this looks like a continuation of something you've seen before, rather than something that has just cropped up. And so there is a sense, certainly people are wondering, and I cannot speak to Moldova, I can speak to the Georgian situation. People are wondering whether Georgia might be next. And there are signs that, of course, there is intent in the way that Georgia has been talked about in some contexts. Mr. Ballantyne disagrees strongly, but I'm sure he can mention that later. But we have seen very aggressive wordings from in various Russian contexts, in which the idea that these states might be sovereign and might be able to chart their own path is called into question. There's also the challenge, as some scholars have pointed out, that if that things could go badly for example, for Georgia either way, that if the Kremlin prevails in Ukraine, then it has no particular reason to stop because it crossed the Rubicon, so to speak. But if it doesn't prevail, and if it doesn't go well, it will feel the need to assert, and just to show that it can, that people can have a terrible time if they try to stand up to the Kremlin. So there is a view, again, there are very different views from Tbilisi, but there are certainly some people who think that this is a very, very perilous time. And I think from the outside, and as people that think of this from Washington or from other locations, this is a time where you really may want to think about what exactly that implies and where to go with this. And certainly for the people inside Georgia, they will need to think about civil resistance as well, not least because, or various forms of what they can engage with. That shouldn't go as far as the xenophobia that unfortunately one has seen it directed at everyday Russians who come to Georgia, and whatever one thinks of their collective responsibility. Maybe this is, one can have discussions about this, but I think first and foremost, people should be treated as individuals. And this is also something that friends of Georgia need to keep really front and center in a situation like this. So I think to conclude, this is a tricky time. My personal sense is, I've just written an article about some of the ethical implications of what we've seen in Ukraine. I do think this is a profound paradigm shift. And if we take it seriously as such, as a paradigm shift, I think it has implications. And my own sense, to put it somewhat drastically, I do think when it's a 10-year timeline of turbulence that people should get ready for. Thinking of this as this is going to be over in 10 days or in 10 weeks, or in 10 months is very, very optimistic. It could happen, but the switch is so profound, and the challenge to multilateralism is so profound that one does need to think in a longer perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hans, very much. Just a couple of points that I heard was that as we're thinking about peacemaking on Ukraine, we should be very realistic about the likely responses from Russian leadership. What are their strategy? What is their strategic thinking about peacemaking? What is realistic? What can we do? Second point is around how the decision making should really be in the hands of Ukrainians as they think through the best type of peace for them. Another point which I think is very important is around accuracy of storytelling, that we should be making sure that we're robust in our storytelling on all sides, because that helps with the credibility. You raised this question around a fear of who is next, that this a type of military force can be used in other places, and it could be used if Russia wins, and it could be used if Russia loses because of that impact on pride and sensibilities. And then this this last point around needing to think long-term while in conflict and crisis. You talked about 10 years. OECD DAC, so the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, talks about a 20 to 40-year timeline for a transition from war, if you're lucky. That's the ideal timeline to transition from war, provided you don't have a resumption of hostilities in the first 3 years. So thank you very much for that, Hans. Lastly, we have my dear colleague, Professor Zheng Wang. He is the director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. He's a professor at the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall. He's currently a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, a fellow of international security at New America, and a member of the National Committee on United States-China Relations. He has extensive professional academic experience in the Asia Pacific. He's been a Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the United States Institute for Peace and is non-residential Senior Fellow at 2 Chinese universities. And I apologize, Professor Wang, I will not try to pronounce them. He also, at the center, he runs our work on US-China dialogue and Asia-Pacific security, including some very important Track 2 initiatives. So both an academic and a peace practitioner. So, Professor Wang, we're very interested in what you believe are the implications for other conflict contexts, such as in Taiwan.
Thank you, David. I also want to welcome everyone for attending today's event. Like Professor Wood mentioned, this will be one of the series of the event the center will present to our students, our community members. And I also want to thank the 3 great presentations by our guest panelists. Just like Dr. Jensen mentioned about, this is unexpected war to everyone. We all shocked to witness this brutal invasion, and especially the civilian suffering, just like Nina just very well telling us about that. So this is unexpected. I think the first thought I want to share with everyone is that I think after the happening of the war, I think that our institutions, our research organizations, think tanks, we are not designed for predicting war and for preventing war. We conduct a lot of research which is more like macro geopolitical analysis. We need more organization like USIP. We need more people like Nina, like Professor Wood, work in the field rather than we are sitting in the comfortable office trying to conduct some geopolitical analysis. I will talk more about that when I talk about Taiwan, because I think also this is also related when we talk about Taiwan. I believe many people, when we talk about Taiwan, we focus on how to preparing for war, but we are not paying enough efforts for how do we stop war, how do we preventing another war. And I also agree with Hans just mentioned that I think this is a paradigm change, and this war in Ukraine has brought down the curtain on the post-Cold War era. We are not sure what the new era will looks like, whether this is the end of American peace, or whether, like Fukuyama mentioned about the failure of the Russia will be, make a possible new birth of the liberal freedom. But we know the impacts of the war will be huge. And for me, as a scholar, study East Asia, study US-China relations, I know the impacts for the East Asia is also very big. And people are beginning to talking about, can the East Asian peace, which has lasted for several decades, can still survive? And particularly, there's many parallels between Taiwan and Ukraine. Indeed, there's a lot of similarities that in terms of the conflict dynamics and also the sources of the conflict between Ukraine and Taiwan. So for example, if we look at from the perspective of realism, we can say there is a typical security dilemma between a threatening major rising power and its smaller neighbor. So just like the University of Chicago scholar, very famous realist, John Mearsheimer mentioned about the war becomes possible or even inevitable when a smaller states seek security, alliance security, protection from another major power, which happened to be the enemy country of the smaller country's big neighbor. So a lot of discussion from the realism perspective. And from the perspective of identity politics, nationalism, I can tell you, I was shocked to watch Putin's remarks on February 24 before he launched the war. I asked my students to read the speech. I can tell you, if we just replace the word he mentioned, Ukraine, by Taiwan, this could be the exactly same speech a Chinese leader can talk about Taiwan. So both Russia and China make the claims of a shared heritage, historic memory, identity, culture with people within Ukraine and Taiwan respectively. It's full of historic memory and their own interpretation of the history. And we can say their motivation is driven by this kind of historic national trauma, like Putin consider the collapse of Soviet Union as national trauma. And those kind of imagined glory of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And in China, the same thing, people have this kind of historic memory and see the current separation as the trauma and see the future reunification as the glory, as the last piece of the so-called the China's rejuvenation. So we see the same kind of dynamic. And from the perspective of liberalism, we can say this is also, China-Taiwan is also between, just like Russia-Ukraine, is between an autocratic state and a new democracy. So we see a lot of similarities. And I think the war, especially the 30 days of war, probably provide very important lessons to people of Taiwan, people of China, and the entire global society. That is, if there's anything happen between China and Taiwan, I believe the consequence were even worse than that we have witnessed from the Ukraine war. There are several reasons for me to say that. First is that more likely there will be involvement of United States if there will happen between China and Taiwan. And also there will be much bigger disruptions to world economy because China's economy is 10 times of that of Russia. And China is the largest trade partner with over 120 countries in the world. Think about the disruption to supply chain, from a country as a world factory. And also, I think it's very important. I think it's just like Nina just mentioned about helping us to see the war from the civilian perspective. Very often when we're trying to study a conflict, we're not trying to understand it from civilian perspective. So I think I would say that from a civilian perspective, Taiwanese civilian perspective, I would probably make this conclusion. I think Taiwan is not defendable because it's much smaller than Ukraine. It's too close to mainland China. It is very easy to isolate. It's surrounded by water. There's no escape. For Ukraine, there's many people they can, we saw the 3.5 million refugees, but it's more difficult to think about, how the Taiwanese people, if the war happened, where they could escape. So basically, I think if we're trying to study the situation of the Taiwan, we would say China-Taiwan, we would say that the war, if the war happens, it will be maybe I could put this way, it's not affordable to the entire world. The destruction, the disruptions to world economy, to many different aspects of the human lives will be huge. But when we talk about the the current situation, just like I mentioned, I believe our institution, our research organization are not designed for making peace. So currently, I also mentioned these ideas in several different meetings I attended, is that everybody is talking about the parallels, the similarities between Taiwan and Ukraine. And also there's a strong voice about how do we preparing a war between China and Taiwan? How do we arm Taiwan? And so we can make it, maybe can deter or even defeat China. I even heard some very famous scholars talking about, Taiwanese government should giving the weapons to the civilians and train them to, to preparing for a war. But
Professor Wang, 1 minute, please.
Okay, but my point will be that I think the war is not inevitable. We shouldn't assume that the war is inevitable between China and Taiwan. There's still big space for making peace. There are several reasons for that. First one is that between China and Taiwan, there's no violent conflict, no blood, no hatred. Of course, there's the rising nationalism and shifting identity, but there's no violent conflict of past. There's a very high level of economic integration. Taiwan's trade surplus with mainland China and Hong Kong last year is over $90 billion US. And also the two parts of the China-Taiwan, they're the same ethnic group, speak same language, they have the same cultural heritage.
Professor
And also,
Wang, I'm going to have to wrap you up, unfortunately.
Yeah, just the last point. Yeah. So I think that there's still a lot of space for making peace, and we should work for that. We should try to helping, the two sides trying to not only, because if we just preparing for war, it will make the war more possible. And we should try to do something to mediating, to trying to make peace. And also, I hope this work can help the both sides to realize that the war is not affordable, and there's no winner in war, and there's no loser in peace. I will stop here, David. Yeah.
Wonderfully put. Thank you so much. And I think you've created the first question for discussion. I'll ask one question, and then I believe Mr. Stephen Ballantyne has his hand up as well. So my question for all the panelists would be, we've been talking about defeating Russia. Well, some parties have. How do we talk about building peace with Russia? What does it mean to build peace with Russia over Ukraine? That would be my question. And within that, how do we give Ukrainian women a bigger voice? That would be the second part of my question. Mr. Stephen Ballantyne, over to you for your question, please, sir, or your perspective.
Thank you for that. First of all, my apologies to Hans Friedrich. I had no idea that I was visible to you, and my shaking of my head wasn't meant to put you off. I apologize. But you raised an interesting point about who's next. And I think I would invite the panel to consider, certainly Dr. Zheng Wang said that he mentioned Dr. John Mearsheimer, who spoke eloquently about the Ukraine crisis for a decade now. And he's been consistently predicting this war, I think, steadfastly in the face of a lot of criticism. And I think his point is this: if you ignore the Russian fear, the existential fear that they have of Ukrainian joining NATO, then you are missing the point of the peace. without that central issue being addressed, I don't think there can be peace. Now, I have another question, and it's to do with, I think it was the title of the conference, or the discussion, and that is the civilian resistance. And Hans Friedrich, you had mentioned that the Georgian degree of resistance was vastly different to what we see in Ukraine. My concern, I'd like the panel to address this, is President Zelensky is a brave man, no doubt. He's a patriot, no doubt, but he doesn't seem to have a clear end game. The last man, last bullet type of response, which is filtered down to civilians everywhere, seems to be counterproductive. The last man, last bullet. I'd like the panel perhaps to comment on that. Thank you.
Great. If it's okay, I'll hand the word first to Nina, and then I'll come in for you, Hans, if that's all right. Nina, would you like to respond on those 2 points? How do we build peace with Russia? And what is the deeper strategy of the Ukrainian leadership, other than, I've forgotten the phrase already, last man, last bullet standing? Please, Nina. You are on mute, Nina.
It's interesting, and you know, after we fail with our foresighting of this conflict, I have no idea how to put Russia or put two these imperialistic centers together, because 20 years ago, when I was on the political science department, we predict the conflicts, and the conflict in Ukraine, we are like simulate this conflict. But for me, it was like a game. And now we have this new reality. And of course, we need all this system of security now in a change. And I have no idea also how it will be, or what we will have in the next. But my historical background show, or I don't know, explain me that it's a normal way for in history. Everything changes like every 100 years, every 200 years. But of course, for me, it's very important how we can survive in all of this. And but how put Putin on the table of peace negotiation or other parties. And in the same way, I'm always thinking about Ukrainian position and President Zelensky. And it's, for me, it's like a suicide way, because nobody help, nobody, just, it's like guerrilla, because the other countries sent to us just small arm. So what it mean? We have to take this arm and go in the forest? So I don't know. And it's like I don't know, we ignore, or not we, all society, also UN member ignored the fact of occupation of territories of Ukraine. And now we have this new escalation. So maybe it's also the fail of international community and the OEC region, because everybody allowed to do this. And now we have, I hope, not, but everybody in Poland even expect Russian troops next to the Poland border.
Thank you, Nina. Hans, you had your hand up to respond to that question. Perhaps to you next.
Well, yes, thank you for that question. I think it raises an important point, and that does need to be addressed fairly directly. I understand Mr. Mearsheimer's argument. I think it's important that arguments like this are made. That's exactly one of the key things of within a democracy, that we debate the merits and the challenges of various policies. In the end, I do not find it plausible for multiple reasons. And one of the key reasons why I don't find it plausible is because the idea that about Russia's, so to speak, existential fear, one may just want to recall that, of course, the moment when NATO troops were moved a little bit eastward, and that's, you can look that up wherever you want, is after 2014, precisely after Crimea was seized. So the fundamental demand for NATO and security alliances is a result of the Kremlin's aggression. And I understand that countries that would prefer to subjugate their neighbors dislike if there are defensive alliances, but that does not make the defensive alliance in itself illegitimate. And rather, the point that Henry Kissinger has made in writing about the Congress of Vienna, and the Congress of Vienna, by the way, may have been a great model to find a peace settlement, because the fundamental challenge of a disjuncture between de jure and de facto control is the challenge that was faced in 1814. The other challenge, that bilaterally the conflicts had become unsettleable because it was a kind of winner take, it was zero-sum games. And so I've made this argument. It was an unpopular argument to make. I kind of have broadly hidden it from my friends and colleagues because I realized it was an unpopular argument, but I've made that argument in foreign policy at some point, that the Congress of Vienna might have been an approach, but we're not there at this point. And rather, going back to what Kissinger has said, the quote is, whenever peace, conceived as the avoidance of war, has been the primary objective of a power or a group of powers, the international system has been at the mercy of the most ruthless member of the international community. And that is the situation right now. And if one puts that ruthlessness, rewards that, I'm not entirely sure where it stops. And Mr. Ballantyne, we all take our choices. If your country was attacked and the alternative was ultimately subjugation, it will be your choice about what you're going to do. I know what mine is. And I have a lot of sympathy with the people of Ukraine who are skeptical about what's being held out to them from the Kremlin.
Thank you very much, Hans. Donald or Professor Wang, would you like to add any points to that? Perhaps Donald? You're on mute, sir.
Yes, I would. Yes, I would. If I could pile on Mearsheimer for a second. The problem with his analysis, and there are many, I think, is that that kind of approach tends to ignore the fact that these are real countries with separate cultures and values, and as Nina and her colleagues so bravely show, civil societies. And a major difference between Belarus and Ukraine is that the sense of identity, the civil society that holds the fire on the Zelensky government in peacetime is there now bravely manning the barricades and doing those other wonderful things that Nina said. And I don't think that Mearsheimer seems to get that. Point two, Dave, is I do think there's an end game for Zelensky. In some ways, I think they will accept no NATO membership and neutrality, whether you call it Finnish or Austrian, in exchange for security guarantees. It's some of the other problems where Russia seems very intractable that I think are the problem. I think it was Hans Friedrich who mentioned identity and information earlier, and I think Ukraine over the past 8 years has been greatly harmed by the fact that so many outsiders accept the Russian disinformation narrative. Divided by language, it's not a real country, fascism and all that other nonsense. And I think that may have colored Russia's own belief about what was going on there, and then leading to surprises they found in the first couple of weeks. Separatists, how many times have we heard about separatists, which in fact, beginning in 2014, never really existed. It was a Russian creation. And so when Russia acts militarily based on these misperceptions, they get surprised. And that's what we've seen in the last couple of weeks. Finally, I don't think we should worry so much about making peace with Russia or making peace with Putin or not arguing or angering Putin so he becomes more provocative. I think the problem Russia has is that elites, not the whole society, are at war with the international system, not in the same way the Chinese are, but they are. And I think pacifying Russia is going to require a major change in values and attitudes in that Russian elite that now runs the country. And so I think that this argues that the West should be unified and pushed back forcefully. I would personally think that our reaction since the Maidan has been too weak, and we let Georgia down as well. So I think the problem is the Kremlin. It's not the West. Many problems that we might have. End of speech, David.
Thank you very much. Professor Wang, any point from you before we move on to the next set of questions?
Okay, just quickly just mention about, because I mentioned about Mirs Schimmer, but Mirs Schimmer, he predicted quite many wars. So he also predicted there will be war between China and the US. And so, and also, just like I think Dr. Jensen mentioned about, I think very often, just like I mentioned, that people overlooked, not actually about the realist suggestions, but very often is that people overlooked the complexity of the identity politics, how the historical memory, how the identity issues make the situation more complicated and more dangerous. I think for both Ukraine and Taiwan, the complexity coming from this very complicated history and the different sides, their interpretation of the history. Just like I mentioned, there's no hatred between China and Taiwan. What motivated people to the current situation is the nationalism, and the nationalism is motivated by the different historical memory, different identity, and also the rise and fall of the big power is also generating this kind of shifting identity among the people. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. We actually have a stack of questions. I think we'll take three. Before we get them, just to add onto this point of looking in the right direction. If we're looking to prevent wars from happening, prevent human suffering, we need to be looking in the right direction to understand what it is that is likely to lead there. And like Nina and actually Hans, I was in Georgia in 2008, and if you looked at the OSCE's monitoring reports of the South Ossetia, they were saying it's not a question of if conflict happens, but when it happens, given the escalating number of ceasefire breaches. But we weren't looking at that as in that direction and taking it seriously. So we really need to collectively as an international community. As I said, we have a stack of questions. I will ask people to read out their own questions rather than me doing so, because I'm sure your voices are much more beautiful than mine. The first person we have is Jason Yin. Jason Yin, please do ask your question or make your point. Jason, are you there? In which case we'll move on to Kevin Hull. Please, Kevin. Oh, Jason, you're on mute, sir. Jason, you're on mute. Jason, you are on mute still.
Okay, it's okay.
Thank you.
Oh,
perfect.
Sorry. Yeah, my name is Jensen Yi. I'm the professor at the School of Business. So I'm very concerned about the development in Ukraine. My heart goes with the people suffered there. And I watch TV every day to follow the event. I really feel painful for the people. They don't deserve this kind of situation. But also, my question is, and maybe Dina can help me with that. During this war, you can see Americans also play a big role. But as President John Biden mentioned, he is a big dilemma to deal with. On the one hand, he can do something like economic sanction. On the other hand, he had to deal with the World War III. So given that dilemma, the economic sanction would not stop the suffering for the people in Ukraine. But it's kind of jeopardy. I want to know, I saw the presentation of President Zelensky at the US Congress, but now I want to know for Ukrainian people, how do they undertake about the American position or the dilemma facing? Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. If it's okay, Nina, we'll just ask for 2 more questions and then we'll do a round of responses, I think. Mr. Kevin Hull, please.
Yes, my question was partly about with some of the complex analyses that people are trying to do, particularly people who are searching for peace sometimes don't go along with a lot of the narratives. And I've noticed that sometimes people are called traitors who suggest that maybe NATO isn't completely innocent. And I was wondering, do you think that attitude will make it harder for peacemakers? And also concerning sanctions, there are people who say sanctions are a war crime because they target civilians and affect the poorest, and are even blamed for killing kids and 500,000 children in Iraq. So I was wondering, particularly since somebody else asked about that, is what your thoughts on that are, and how that should affect all this affects our response and what we should do.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Craig, I know you prefer me to read it out, but Craig Oliphant, if you can read your own question and ask it, I think that would be best.
Thanks, David. If you can hear me, Craig Oliphant, Foreign Policy Centre in London. Many thanks to all the speakers and for those insights you've been sharing. I suppose my question, I very much share what Dom Jensen was saying or conveying on his assessment of the Russian military and an operation that has stalled and shifted to that terrible phase of attrition at scale. But I suppose the nagging question, probably for all of us, given a Russian military doctrine of escalate to de-escalate, I wondered what concerns both Donald and maybe other panelists have about the potential use of non-conventional munitions in this war, and obviously primarily thinking of chemical and tactical nuclear or nuclear shells. And in that eventuality, God forbid, what should NATO's response be? Thank you.
Thank you. These are big questions. Also, just a clarification that our colleague Hans, I think is Hans Gutsbrod, not Hans Friedrich. So just so everyone is aware. So we have these 3 questions. What is the Ukrainian perspective on the dilemma facing the United States, whether to restrict itself to economic sanctions or to move beyond that? The second question is, are we giving enough room to peacemakers, or are we reducing the space for them to challenge our ideas by calling those who go against normative ideas, traitors or other negative things? And this big question, what do we do in the event of non-conventional weapons? And we might already be seeing the edges of non-conventional weapons being used in Ukraine in terms of some of the new forms of weapons being deployed. Nina, again, I would like to start with you, please.
Yeah. Thank you for these questions, but it's not very easy questions. And the first question about position of society, after Maidan, not everything so easy and clear, and there are no the party of democracy in Ukraine. But so it's not like from Putin propaganda, but not the so perfect that like it's expressing in a maybe European and American media, because we have just one right position. which promoted from government side, and all others position not count like right position. And this question connected with the next. And I continue my story because I'm Traitor of Motherland. Nice to meet you. And because I'm on a Peacemaker, it's a militarized website, because of my first research. And they blame me in the fact that I was able to work from one side and another side. I have a case in European Court of Human Rights, and from September, the European Court of Human Rights started communication with the Ukrainian government, and just before 24, maybe 23 of February, I sent my response to the European Human Rights Court. So it's not easy, and of course it's the space are shrinking for dialogue, for discussion, for open discussion. And all these 8 years I heard like it's not time for this discussion because it's a wartime. It's not time for this because it's we need this. It's not time to raise the issue of violence or far rights because they also exist like everywhere, like in America, like in Europe, everywhere. And of course we have this, but nobody prosecute this. And I really angry to our government also because of this, because they are pretend that they like a blind. So this is a mess of problems, and there are no black and white. Everything connect with everything. So, and of course I don't want to show a lot of facts to not be an again traitor of motherland like on the next level, because 2 days ago I also received messages from my so-called friends who are find who is wrong, because of course this conflict from the explanation because of me and my team in the Center of Social and Labor Research, because we had the monitoring of far rights extremism in Ukraine. So of course we help to Putin make this invasion. So that's it. So it's not so clear and so easy, and of course we have everything from this. Sorry, it's a bit difficult to be so.
Nina, you're amazingly eloquent. Do not apologize. Thank you so much, Nina. Donald, I can see your mic is off. Would you like to come back on these points next?
I would. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Just to run down quickly, on the issue of traitors, yes, extreme wars radicalize societies, often unfairly. I agree that it's a really real problem. Public opinion is extremely high in favor of the war, resisting Russia, and in favor of President Zelensky. And as we all know, his poll rating before the conflict was relatively low. And now I don't know how all of this will play if there is a peace on the eternal issues, it seems, that Nina talked about. I just don't know. On the issue of NATO misbehaving, I think that it's not very helpful in dealing with the current situation to say, well, we invaded Iraq 20 years ago or NATO made mistakes. I think that, well, yeah, I think that the NATO expansion issue has been much overblown, and what we told Gorbachev and so forth. NATO went very carefully in terms of taking new members, trying to accommodate Russian interests, trying to include them in the NATO-Russia Coordination Council, and so forth. Number three, someone asked David about the Wagner Group. They're now renamed in Ukraine Liga. There are, I don't know how many are there, but I certainly don't think they were pulled out of Libya, among other places, and I don't see that they will make much of a difference on the ground. But like with the Chechens, they are sort of elite, and they have specific tasks like trying to assassinate Zelensky. The Azov Brigade is a strong weakness. Their behavior has been horrible in the past. Some Ukrainians would say they are better integrated than before into the Ukrainian armed forces. Nina would be the expert, not me, but certainly they are, whatever you think of their personal excesses, they are heroically fighting in Mariupol at the moment, and that should count for something as well. What I don't care for, however, is that we focus on Azov, which I would say is a fascist division and should be banned. But some people focus on that, and justifiably so, but the many instances of Russian military misbehavior or worse in the past month really to get a short shrift from some of these same people. There are abuses and criminal activity on both sides, and when you're bombing maternity hospitals, I think that counts for something in weighing up the totality of sins and non-sins that some of these units are engaged in. We saw a rape yesterday, reportedly. So I'm not sure focusing just on Azov, correctly criticized as they are, offsets the need to look at some of the other Russian behavior, the Chechen in particular. But that's just my view. I see Stephen is shaking his head.
Stephen, you're a troublemaker, it seems. Hans, over to you.
Yes, thank you for the questions. I think and I agree with many of the previous comments. Craig, to your points, I do think that the future will be very hard to navigate, and there will be challenges, and not just right now in the next 10 days, but again in the next 10 weeks and in the future. And I do think going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and understanding just how important also in small environments it is to have an open discussion and not to fall prey to groupthink at such a time is important. And that's why also particular kinds of rhetoric like traitor just shouldn't be in the bloodstream, so to speak, of democracies. Again, it needs to be respectful when views are being put forward and not kind of make light of the situation of anyone. But I do think that procedural component is important. On the NATO mistake, and I know that time's limited, but I do want to make the point. I've just made the point. I will put the link in the chat in an article. In my view, holding out that promise was legitimate because it is a legitimate thing for democracies to, or countries that aspire to be democratic, and NATO was a very, very positive force in ensuring civilian control over the military. That is a good thing in democracies. So it was legitimate. It was understandable in 2008 because we all faced a context of terrorism, which many people forget. Beslan, London, Madrid, and that was the main preoccupation. And it's now looking back that we look at it different. Was it wise? I think it is fair to have a discussion about that. And people like John Sawers have made the point that maybe it wasn't wise. But let's keep things in perspective. As Donald has said, it is overblown to the extent if you think that the appropriate response is a military aggression, then you think it's okay to break someone's jaw because the towels weren't folded properly. That's the level of disproportionality, not only that jaws are broken in this particular case, but that people are being killed. And so I think that thing needs to be kept in perspective. But a key point is that the West does need to think about its mistakes, and it's very profound mistakes, and it does need to think about how to re-legitimize democracies, from the opioid epidemic across the 2008 consequences of the financial crisis to the sense that a lot of people have that the game is rigged. And it is fundamentally important, if this is a long-term conflict, that the societies are seen as broadly legitimate. That doesn't mean that every outcome is great, but that broadly there's a sense of legitimacy. And so introspection and being clear about what our mistakes are and that we need to fix them as a society, I think, is at the core. And that will also have an impact on how people in Russia, many people in Russia, will see the West in the future. And so I do think, again, introspection in some ways and being open about our weaknesses and failures is a key part of what ultimately makes the West, broadly conceived, with all of its mistakes, a better society.
Wonderful, thank you. Professor Wang, over to you for final words. Then just to give everyone a heads up, we've hit the half-hour mark, as in 11:30 East Standard Time. I will give opportunity for final round of questions and then closing remarks. In your closing remarks, you can choose to answer a question from the final round or not. It will be up to you. Professor Wang, please, any thoughts from your side?
Okay, I just want to thank everybody for the very insightful points and very good discussions. And I think it's important that I agree that all the parties, we should reflect the mistakes the parties made during the process. And because it's easy to blame another party, another person, but we should reflect, just like I mentioned, I think we were trying to, the current system is designed for preparing for war rather than making peace, and we should trying to work on that and trying to do something. Everybody can do something, and there should be a global reflection about the Ukraine war and why it happened. So yeah, thanks everyone, and it's a great panel. And like we mentioned, that this is the first one. We are going to host more this kind of discussion, and looking forward to welcoming you back. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So then, just for the final questions that we have, and if you can ask them quickly, so we can have some final thoughts as well, that would be good. Jasmine De Leon, apologies if I pronounced your name incorrectly. Jasmine, please.
That's fine. Thank you to the panelists for coming. I'm a student at the School of Diplomacy. So someone mentioned that it is important that the narrative seen around the world is true and factual on both the Ukraine narrative and the Russia narrative. So what role does transparency and social media play in the conflict, and how might these factors affect the outcome?
Wonderful, thank you. Anderson or Sydney Dyer, please.
Yes, I would like to say thank you to the panelists as well. Do you think the West would be able to impose sanctions on China effectively without extreme negative impacts to the West, is my question.
Wonderful. And unfortunately, the last question will be with Padovish. Then for those who have put questions below in the chat, thank you for them, and apologies we don't have time to get to them. Padovish.
Thank you. Thank you to all the experts as well. My question was kind of linked to the discussion of Dr. Hans and Dr. Van. I just think that the conflict might not have an impact only on Georgia or Taiwan, but it will in a way strengthen all the other authoritarian political rulers. So do they think that this type of attitude will enable or strengthen other political authoritarian leadership? North Korea or Syria are some examples, but I know that there are so many others who are not so democratic. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And apologies for my mismanagement of the time, everyone, and that we're running over. But colleagues, so final opportunity for your thoughts, and if you have any thoughts on those questions that were asked around the likely impact of strengthening authoritarianism, around the potential for sanctions towards China, and around this, how we deal with transparency of narrative, that would be great. So Nina, we'll put you last, and we'll start with Donald because his hand is up. So Donald, perhaps if you can.
All right, thank you. I didn't expect to be first, but just a couple points. Americans like to end on a positive note, so let me be negative. On the question of nukes, which I forgot to mention earlier, yes, I do think Putin would use them, at least a 50-50 chance, certainly in a limited way, tactical battlefield, detonating in the air, or something like that. These people are not, they don't want to lose. They are not, whoever said, they don't see win-win. And I think from my own context in that rarefied atmosphere contacts, they tell themselves, I know for a fact, that they don't want to go out meekly like Gorbachev did. Jasmine, if you're there, social media has been key, especially to finding out what's going on in Russia. And I just direct you to the alleged casualty lists, which are on social media, often taken down and so forth. So even as the Kremlin, I mentioned Belarus, has become more expert at using social media to control the opposition, it's not easy to do. And I think we've seen social media becoming a tool not only of authoritarian dictatorships to consolidate their power, but also civil society to communicate with one another. So from my days at RFERL, we've gone from shortwave to FM, now to social media. Each time the delivery, and YouTube, each time the delivery becomes more sophisticated, and then the forces readjust, and we have to readjust to these means of communication.
Thank you so much for that. And also, I just like to thank United States Institute for Peace. Also, you have been providing speakers in all of these crisis conversations. So we also had one of your colleagues on Afghanistan, and we appreciate that blossoming partnership. So thank you. Hans, perhaps if you're okay to go next.
Yes, so I'll just focus on one thing, given the shortness of time, on the authoritarian component. There is, of course, we need to be, what can I say, realistic about the very severe risks and threats we face, but I will say two maybe slightly optimistic things. A very strong narrative has been put out in Russia that goes in one direction, and whichever way this is going to go, more than 100,000 soldiers will come home and will tell a story that almost certainly is going to be very, very, very different from anything that Russians have heard on their state media. And I do think that will have a profound impact in the long term. So I'm not saying this is automatically going to lead to great results, but there is at least a prospect that some profound change happens there. And if you look at the end of the Soviet Union, that was tied up with another such instance of people coming back from war and a war having a big impact. I would say, at least for now, I do think we need to really think very profoundly about democracies, as I've said earlier. But at least for now, when we look at Europe, I think some of the right-wing for Europe, specifically, some of the right-wing authoritarians have been greatly weakened because they have, in a way, tried to lean up to, or kind of oriented themselves on Putin as a protector of the family and traditional values. And now we see that maybe there was a rather different story there.
Thank you, Hans. Zheng, if it's okay, I'll go to you next before finishing with Nina.
Palavish, I think you asked a very good question. I believe this will provide a major strategic test for all the leaders. All the state leaders, they are facing choices, they are facing tests, and they need to make choices. But I would say that whether state leaders or whether the citizens, if their beliefs of history, their concept of territory has already become a part of their national identity narrative, it's very difficult to change. It cannot, even under the pressure and the threats. So this is the bad news. But I think that they will still need to reflect what is the best way to protecting their interests. So that goes connecting with the question about sanctions on China, whether it can be effective. I think the Chinese leader will realize that the sanctions on China will definitely give Chinese economy, China's stability, the regime stability a major challenge. But of course, just like I mentioned, China is the world factory, is the world's #1 manufacturer, is the trade partner, top trade partners with over 120 countries. So a sanction on China will bring a huge unthinkable impact of global economy, and probably something the world cannot afford. So I hope all the parties, like I mentioned, this is a conclusion. A conflict between China, Taiwan, and the United States is the world cannot afford. We have to action now to stop it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. That was very eloquently put. Nina, it'd be great to have some final concluding thoughts from you, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for this invitation, and it's difficult to make any conclusion in this. And I just last thought in my head, it's just about, I feel this big gap between the people dimension and the political dimension. And all these years, I'm just thinking about how to make this gap close, because when we was close to the contact line and people was in a queue from non-government controlled territories and government controlled territories, and nobody had any argue or nobody kill each other, but I don't know how to. It's possible to speak about something in the future. It's something very practical in the society, but I don't know how it's what is wrong on the political level. Sorry.
No, but this is an important point of bridging the gap between the people and the politics. And this comes back to our first question to you, Nina, about the voice and making sure that women have a voice within the social decisions that are being made, in the domestic political decisions and in the political process. But thank you for joining, Nina, especially in your difficult circumstances, and our hearts and well wishes are with you, your families, your friends, your loved ones, your colleagues, and also those on the other side who are losing people and who are concerned and worried. A final point from me would be this question around traitors and peacemakers. I think the role of a peacemaker is one of the hardest ones because we disagree with everyone, and no one quite likes us because we disagree with everyone. And our role, even though it's very difficult, is to challenge and test people when they don't want to be challenged and tested. So your work, Nina, is very brave, and if there's any way that we can support you, work with you, then we would love to do so. For those on the call, we will write up a short report. The video will also be put on our website, and we will keep in touch, and we will send out any further updates as the series continues. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for the difficult questions and the different perspectives, and that's why we talk, because of those perspectives. Thank you, everyone. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Goodbye.
much. Bye-bye.